going to talk through basically my maggot rig down the middle on lakes like this where it's only 15-16 metres wide. Now, a lot of my fishing I keep it as simple as I can, and all my rigs are very similar. Now, this rig is basically the only rig I use down the middle of maggots. The size of float changes obviously within depths and wind, but as far as all it is, it's 015 mainline. I've got 2 back shots, number 8s above it. Now, today I've got a 4x12s float. I try and use the lightest float I can get away with. So I've got probably nearly 5 foot. So 4x12s is perfect, if anything. If the wind got up too much, I might be more tempted to step up to a 4x14s. Likewise, if it was maybe 6 foot, I'd use probably a 4x14s. Unless it was flat calm, I can get away with the 4x12s. I think just using that lighter float in winter allows you to get more bites. 015 mainline, and then shot in, simple as anything. I've got a bulk of number 10 stots here. Could use 9s, but I'd rather use 10s and just have a few more in my bulk. I think it just sits nicer, and I think it helps stabilise your rig a bit more. And then on this rig I've got 2 number 10 droppers shot, just so they don't move. Because I'm spreading these shot out, they're more inclined to move when I'm netting fish. My bulk is in stots, and that just allows me, if I wanted to move it down, I can, and create it into a bulk and 1 dropper. The only reason I do that is if, say, the fishing was really good and I just wanted to bomb it right down and just get fishing a lot quicker. But in this case, because it's cold, it's winter, I always start off a bulk and 2, and it just creates that slower fall in that extra 6 inch of water. Whereas if I had it as a bulk and 1, it's just in that bottom 12. With a bulk and 2, it's in that bottom 18 inch or so. 5 inch hook length of 011 to a 18's F1 pellet. Again, if it was good, I could step it up to a 16's F1 pellet. Likewise, if it was harder, I might step this down to even 010. But I don't really go lighter than that. If I'm catching some more carp, I could even step it up. It's just dependent on the venue. Elastic, I've got blue hydro today. Again, that's just venue dependent. If it was more carpy, I might step it up. If it's more F1s or it's colder and it's freezing, like say in January, I might even step this down to say a pink or something along those lines. But yeah, that's basically my rig. A nice short lash. I don't want too long of a lash, especially when it's windy. It just allows me to keep it a lot more around my area. Whereas if I had a long lash, my float can blow off where I've actually plumbed up, and it's more important on the shelf, so you're not off the bottom or anything. But yeah, that's my rig, and yeah, we'll get into some fishing. Just before I do some fishing, I've got to tell you about what floats I'm using. I think it's really important, more so in winter, with the size of bristles, if anything. These are Richie Wilson's Maggies in a hollow bristle. That just allows me to see my float, because there's no point having a really thin bristle with a solid tip that you can't see. So I've got a hollow bristle just so I can see the float more than anything. 1.5 mil. Again, I would never step it further up than that. I'd never use a 1.7 or a 2 mil during winter, because it's too positive and it's harder for the fish to pull the float under. Again, a little rugby ball style float with a carbon stem. I think that's important. Again, it's durable, and if I was holding it on a tight line, it just follows the bulking much more naturally. It's important to say that I dot this right down as literally a pimple, where another number 13 would probably overshot it. So I've got a number 13, the trimmer, just underneath my float, just so it's dotted down as far as I can see, basically. So yeah, that's my float, and now I'll get into some fishing. So you've seen my maggot rig for down the track, bulk and 2 droppers, but as far as how I've gone to prime my peg, I always prime it from the off. I always like to have a line where I can be a bit more positive of that off chance that it might be really good. So as far as how I've fed it, I've basically done 2 fingers and a thumb, which is about, I'd say 10 to 15 maggots. I don't know, it depends. 2 fingers and a thumb probably is around 10 to 15 maggots. Every 5 minutes, just 2 lots through a catapult or through my hand. Usually I use a catapult because my feeding by hand isn't great. And then I like to drop on it, usually in a match situation, an hour in, just to see what's there. Now, if I'm getting a lot of roach, a lot of small fish, that's when I'd probably up my feed to, say, 3 fingers and a thumb. That's just a nice way to gauge how much bait you're putting in. But yeah, I've just had a sneaky look. It sat there for a minute and went under, so hopefully there's a few fish there. as far as what colour maggots I'm using reds today. Now, I think that can be quite important. I'm usually a fan of, in summer, personal preference, but when it gets more clear, and it's a lot more clear the water, I think reds definitely are better. So, double red maggot through the fin end. And then I've got a little pot on to start with, just because I like to tighten everything up to start with. And then if I'm getting a lot of fish in my peg and foul looking, that's when I can take the pot off. And they might even come shallow if I start feeding through a catapult more often. So I've got 2 fingers on a thumb in my little cad pot. I could use a sprinkle lid, but I don't think it's that cold yet. If I was fishing another line down my peg, that's when I might use a sprinkle lid and just sprinkle some maggots in. Dunk the pot to keep the maggots in. We'll start fishing. So lay my rig in, lay it past to start with, drag it back, line up, just pop my bait in, not from that big of a height to start with. And then I like to lift my rig up, say a foot out the water, and then just slowly lower it in and just show the fish your bait. And then as it gets to the bottom, just dump it in. So you can see my float's really dotted down, and it just allows me to see any indications, a little indication straight away. So it's quite an uneventful morning dobbing, but it might just be a case that the fish are coming to feed. It can sometimes be like that. So really dotted down, try and hold that back shot, keep your float dead still. I don't like to lift and drop either. Sometimes if there's eyed or other fish that are worth catching, like silvers, sometimes lift and dropping can work for them, but when I'm targeting F1s, a little indication straight away. I don't like to lift and drop, I like to just set my trap and don't move it, because I feel like if you start lifting and dropping, that's when you can start getting problems with foul hookers. I might even take a shot off this, but I can't tell if that's... I'm sure they're little bites. Sometimes the bites can be so finicky. You probably see it better on the camera, but for me that float is really dotted down. Good thing about fishing this deep water as well is later in the session, when more fish gather, you'll see pimples coming up, and it's a good sign that to go on your line. You know, you're not wasting time. I won't give it long till I refeed either. Even though it's dead cold, it's still winter. I think it's important to keep bait still going through your peg. Might do in a minute if I don't get a bite. Just come back in and refeed it through the pot. Likewise, you might, oh, there we go, I don't know if it's in the mouth that, but bit of a weird indication. Okay, this blue hydro is just nice and soft. Let you take your time. They're still pulling a little bit to say it's winter, but take your time. There you go. Looks to be average stamp. F1 say £1.5, £2, and it's a very, this line, this maggot down the middle, is a line that can always come good through, especially in the last like hour and a half when the light drops. It's also worth saying that how far out you want to fish it. Now, it's the same depth as it is, say a section short, it's the same depth as it is where I'm fishing now, but if I fish it that section shorter, yes, I might get cleaner bites. because not as many fish are coming into my peg when it comes good late on, but it stops me from having that chance of catching shallow. Now it's all about putting your odds in your favour, and I'd rather fish that section further out, maybe put up with an odd foul hooker, and it just gives me that chance of catching shallow. Like even throughout winter, you can have days where you'll catch shallow and the big F1s will sit like deep shallow, say 2.5 foot, and that can sometimes be really, like, it can be a really effective way of catching through winter. So never write it off, never think, oh, I'm not going to catch shallow today, so I'll fish it a section shorter. I always like to give myself that option of catching a big weight, and this is the line in winter where I feel like I'm going to do the most damage. Because of having bites so early on this, it might be a case that later on, the more I feed it, the more fish that come into my peg, the better it'll become, and they might even come shallow. I don't expect them to come very shallow, but you can never write it off through winter. Look at that, it's getting really good now. Sat there nice, just a nice dip on your float. You start having problems with liners and everything, like there's no real reason for me to change right now. If I started, not as many fish were visiting my peg, that's when I'd probably start loose feeding. I might go on another line, just to bring some fish back into my peg. Just look there, a bit of a bigger fish. It's important to look where they're hooked as well, like they're all in the top of the mouth. If the hook started hooking them in the bottom, or weren't hooking them like side of the face or something, it might be a case that I'm not seeing the bite when it's happening, and I could be laying too much line on the bottom. And because it's quite silty, when a lot of fish turn up, they can dig away the bottom, so it's often worth checking. If you start foul hooking an odd fish, don't think, oh, they've come shallow, let me just fill it in. Pull them up first and just see if you're still fishing on the bottom, because you'll be amazed how many times where you're just fishing an inch or two off the bottom, especially when it's silty down in the deepest water. So I have another fish, see if we can catch one more, and then we'll fish it out and just see if we can see how good it can get. So again, lift it a foot out of the water, just show the fish your bait. You're amazed how many times where they'll even pull it out on the way down, or as it's settled it'll just sit there and just sit, nice little dink on your float. It's important how many bites you won't see if you don't have it as dotted as you might think. Especially with a hollow bristle as well. Not so much a solid bristle, you can tend to have a little bit more bristle showing. Just hooked another there. It's nice and steady, there's no need to like rush anything either and like push my peg and start loose feeding and throwing a load of maggots in. Because when it's like this, it's nice and steady, and they're not small fish. A lot of the time, your biggest fish will come on this short line. Much bigger fish this actually. Blue elastic's perfect, this blue hydro. Couple strips. You don't want something too heavy or too light. Again, that's probably, say, nearly 3, just over £2 I'd say. Again, look where he's hooked. Top of the lip. Just keep repeating the process. Alright, so I've been fishing it, I wouldn't say for long, but it's definitely got better, and it's coming good really. And it feels like I'm going to get a bite every time I drop in, which is what you want really. So, as far as it's going, I foul up to 1, just off bottom, which is making me think that already that there's a few fish there. And if it keeps happening, that's when I can start pushing my peg. I don't want to push it too early, because right now I'm catching nice on the bottom. There's no need to push my peg, because on matches when in winter you're not fishing for £200 that you might be in summer. You're fishing for like £70 to £100. You know, it depends on the venue and how it's fishing. So that's important as well, to have a look at the results, do some homework, and figure out what you're fishing for. Because if I was fishing for, say, £50, there's no need to push my peg and try and catch shallow. Whereas, say, if I'm fishing for, say, 100 plus pound, that's where you might be thinking, okay, I'm getting a lot of fish in my peg. I wouldn't say feed it for shallow, but loose feed more and see how the fish are reacting towards it. But I don't want to blow my peg up, so I'm just still feeding through a pot. Watch this now, I won't even get a bite now, but yeah, it's just been sat there nice, get a nice dink on my float. That wind's dropped as well, which is making it a lot easier. But if it starts slowing up, that's just telling me that I probably need to rest it, just loose feed some maggots. And it might be a case that next time I drop on it, I take the pot off and try and catch without a pot on, because it's a bit more efficient, a bit quicker than having a pot on. So again, I forgot to say earlier that how much I feed can also determine on the depth. Say if it was a deep peg, I'd be more inclined to feed more maggots. Whereas say if it was 3 foot, a 2 pinch of the thumb's probably right. Whereas say you go 6 foot and plus, you can probably be a bit more aggressive with your bait, because there's more water for the maggots to fall through. And I think in winter, I could be wrong, but I don't think all your maggots are getting to the bottom. Sometimes where I think little roach and stuff and gudgeon and all sorts are picking up maggots on the drop and on the way down. So it's important you still get some maggots to the bottom. Probably the longest I've gone without a bite. This little indication on my float, tiny indications. So it's important as well. I don't want to fish too light of a dropper. So I've got number 10s on. But if I drop down to number 11s, the bites will be even harder to see. So number 10s seem about right on this rig. If I was fishing, say, 4/16s, I'd probably use number 9s. Bigger rig, heavier shotting. But yeah, it depends on what I'm fishing for as well. So what I might do in a minute, if it doesn't go in, say, 10-15 seconds, I'm going to loose feed for a catapult and see what he says. And just see what reaction I get. The fish are still pulling a bit. They're not in full winter mode yet, where you hook them and they just sit there in your peg. Again, this could be foul hooked, so if it is, I take this pot off and just loose feed through a catapult instead. It just spreads that bait out a bit as well. Instead of having it all in one little area, I can spread it out a bit. Take your time, no need to rush. Could just be a better fish. It's in the mouth, it's just a bit of a lunatic. But yeah, we're not in full winter mode yet, so that's why dobbing might not have worked. They might not have fully balled up. I'm still on the feed. Again, it's probably just over a pound. So I'm actually going to do this chuck. Took a bit longer to get a bite then. I'm going to take my pot off and loose feed some maggots. Now this also depends on what I'm fishing for, but if I was only fishing for, say, £60, I wouldn't do this, but just want to see what reaction I get. Through feeding, so again, 2 pinch and thumb. Feed it a little bit more aggressive, try and be as accurate as you can. So that was a bit of a terrible feed, but the whole idea is to just spread them fish out slightly. I'm going to do one more feed because them feeds were terrible. Sometimes, you know, I'm not a fan of feeding over your float. What I mean by that is when your float's settled, feeding over your float, because that's where you tend to foul fish, but it also tells you if fish are off the bottom, or can give you an idea of if fish are in your peg. So I don't mind doing it early on in the session. And just see if we can catch without a pot on. It'll increase the chances of what weight you can catch, because you're constantly attracting new fish into your peg by loose feeding. Whereas with that pot, I'm more or less just catching what's in my peg, what's come to that initial run of bait that I've put in whilst priming it. You know, I could start feeding through a pot and maybe loose feeding after I've hooked a fish to bring new fish into my peg. It's just working out in the day. Every day's a bit different. But if I can't, I'd rather catch whilst feeding without a pot on, just so it gives me more chance of the fish coming shallow and bringing new fish into my peg. See what happens here. Now, the bites can be so small, it's almost like my float just dips a tiny bit, I'll lift into it. Because they're F1s as well, they're a pain sometimes where you literally just wobble your float and it'll be a bite. I think that's why it's important to sometimes still fish a little bit positive, not too positive where you don't get a bite, but as long as your rig itself is quite negative. One of that is your shotting, so it's nice to have still decent droppers on where it shows up that bite. Might have rushed it a little bit quick. You know, we're still early in the session, so I'm not expecting to catch shallow. Indication that's true. What I'm actually going to do, feed a couple times. Not a lot, literally nothing. That was a terrible feed. That's better. Lower that last little bit. A lot of the times I'll take it on the drop, like as it's settled. And sometimes what can happen is, say you've not had a bite in 2 minutes, you can feed over your float and you get a bite straight away. Just that noise and bait falling through the water can just create a bite. A tiny little indication as well. I was actually looking at my back shot then and just couldn't see my float, so again, they're still pulling a bit, they're not in. I thought they'd be in full on winter mode, but they're not. But because I'm catching through this as well, so that's actually hooked in the nose, so that's probably because I've started loose feeding, make them a little bit more erratic. So as you've just seen, I've just had some fish down the middle where I've been priming it for a little bit, dropped on it, it's been really good. We are on our own, so that's probably a factor as well. In a match situation, it might only come good until the last hour, even the last half an hour sometimes. But dropped on it early and just to have a look, really, it's been really good. We've been fishing for probably 20-25 minutes and I reckon I've had nearly 20 pounds, so that's how quick you can put a run of fish into your net. And that's been fishing on the bottom, so if they came shallow you can do a really good weight, so it's also, you can never really write shallow off. As far as how I started it, like I said earlier, loose feeding 15-20 maggots twice every 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, through a catapult or by hand if you can, and then dropped on it with a little cad pot just to see if I can get a quick bite, and it worked. I caught I think 4 or 5 fish dead quick on it, through a cad pot, just feeding 15-20 maggots through a cad pot. And it was good. It was just sat there nice, and then you could just see my peg progressing a bit. Whereas I foul hooked a couple and I lost a few, so that's where I started loose feeding, just to spread my bait out more than anything. And it also gives me more chance of catching shallow, which is how you can do a really big weight, especially in winter. So I started loose feeding some maggots, and it just got better and better. By loose feeding, I'm creating more competition in my peg, and I'm bringing more fish into my peg, if anything, rather than just sneaking in through a pot where I'm not making any noise. But yeah, that's basically how I fish down the middle with maggots.